I was humiliated by Julian as he poured a glass of expensive red wine over my head and forced me to crawl on the cold marble floor to wipe it with my silk dress, because he and his mistress wanted to coerce me into signing over my father's entire estate tonight. The liquid was sticky. It dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. Yet I kept my gaze fixed on the void, pretending to be the blind fool they believed me to be. Julian laughed, a sound like gravel grinding under a boot, while Chloe leaned against the mahogany desk, her heels clicking rhythmically, as she watched my disgrace with a predatory smile. "You are nothing but damaged goods." "Ava," Julian hissed, his voice dripping with a cruelty that was sharper than a blade. "And if you do not sign these papers, your father will not survive another hour in that private clinic." I felt the wet fabric of my dress clinging to my knees, the coldness of the stone floor seeping into my skin, while I maintained the blank stare of a person who had lost everything to the darkness. They did not know that behind my clouded eyes, a pair of high-tech infrared lenses was recording every movement, every document, and every smirk they shared in their arrogance. This was Manhattan, a place where the weak were eaten alive, but I had learned to thrive in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to tear their world apart. Chloe moved closer, her expensive perfume filling the air, before she intentionally pressed the sharp heel of her Louboutin onto my fingers, grinding them into the spilled wine with a calculated force that made my breath catch. "Look at this gutter rat," Chloe whispered, her tone mocking and sweet like poisoned honey. "She used to be the princess of Manhattan, but now she is just a liability, an oxygen thief who cannot even see the light of the sun." I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, keeping my body limp, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream, while my mind recorded every word, every insult, and every detail of their crimes. They thought I was a puppet, a blind doll without a soul. But behind my vacant stares, my iris lenses were capturing the reflection of the offshore account numbers flashing on Julian's computer screen. Every second of this agony was a deposit into my bank of vengeance, a debt that Julian would pay with interest. As I calculated the exact trajectory of his downfall, the pain in my hand was nothing compared to the fire in my heart, a burning desire to see them lose everything, just as they had tried to take everything from me and my dying father. New York was a city of predators, and tonight, the most dangerous one was currently kneeling on the floor, disguised as a broken victim. Julian grabbed my hair, pulling my head back with a jerk, making me face the direction of the camera he held, as he played the live feed of my father gasping for air in his hospital bed. "Do you see this? Ava. Oh, wait. I forgot that you are as blind as a bat. But surely you can hear the silence of a heart monitor when it stops," he said with a chilling laugh, before shoving a fountain pen into my trembling hand. "Sign the documents now. Surrender the $10 billion of the Montgomery Trust. And I might consider letting the old man live another week. Or perhaps I will just have the security guards toss you out onto the streets of New York like the trash you have become." I felt the cold metal of the pen against my skin, my heart racing like a trapped bird, yet I maintained the facade of a broken woman, sobbing quietly, while calculating the exact seconds remaining until my hidden data transfer was complete. The air in the office was thick with the scent of old money and fresh betrayal, a combination that made me want to vomit. But I stayed focused on the mission. My father was the only reason I had endured 3 years of this hellish marriage. 3 years of playing the role of a helpless, blind wife while Julian spent my inheritance on his mistress. I would not let his life end in a sterile room because of a Gontranam, a pathetic man who thought he could outsmart a Montgomery. As I pretended to struggle with the pen, Julian turned back to Chloe, pulling her into a disgusting embrace right in front of my face, thinking I was trapped in an eternal darkness that could not witness their treachery. They spoke of the yacht they would buy with my money, of the penthouse they would renovate after I was sent to the asylum, and of the way they had sabotaged my car to ensure my sight was stolen. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating with the stench of their greed. But I knew that every second of my suffering was a nail in their coffins, a price they would pay 10,000 times over. I was not a victim. I was a hunter, wearing the skin of a lamb, and as the wine dried on my skin, I felt the cold fire of vengeance burning through my veins, stronger than any pain they could inflict. My father built this empire from nothing, and I was the true heir to the Montgomery legacy. A legacy that did not include a snake like Julian Sterling or a parasite like Chloe. They thought they were at the finish line, but they were actually standing on the edge of a cliff. And I was about to give them the final push. The silence of the night was about to be broken by the sound of their empire crumbling, piece by piece, until nothing but dust and regret remained. Suddenly, the heavy oak door creaked open, and the head of security entered, his heavy footsteps echoing against the high ceiling, as he informed Julian that a black SUV was idling outside the gates of the estate. Julian's grip on my arm tightened, his paranoia flaring like a sudden fever. While he demanded to know who would dare visit the Sterling mansion at such a late hour without an appointment, I knew who it was. The only man in New York powerful enough to make Julian Sterling tremble. And as the panic began to seep into Julian's voice, I felt a surge of triumph that was almost intoxicating. Chloe hissed a curse, her face twisting in a mask of fear, as she realized that her perfect little world of lies was beginning to crack under the pressure of an unseen force. The security guard looked uneasy, his eyes shifting between Julian and the window. Sensing that the tide was turning in a direction they were not prepared for, Julian cursed under his breath, dropping my arm as if I were a piece of contaminated meat, and rushed toward the window to see for himself who had arrived. I stayed on the floor, my fingers still stained with wine, but a cold smile touched my lips for the briefest second, invisible to anyone who was not looking closely. "Get her to the basement," Julian barked at the guard, his eyes darting toward the window, as he tried to hide the contract under a pile of useless folders. But I refused to move, making my body heavy and difficult to handle. "If it is Liam Vanderbilt at the door, you are already dead," I whispered in the depths of my mind, while I allowed the security guard to drag me across the floor, leaving a trail of red wine behind me like a path of blood. The doorbell rang, a sharp and authoritative sound that cut through the tension, signaling the arrival of my savior and the beginning of Julian's descent into hell. As the guard lifted me up, I caught a glimpse of the front gate on my lens feed, seeing the silver lion emblem of the Vanderbilt family, and I knew that tonight, the blind girl would finally begin to see the blood of her enemies. Julian looked like a cornered animal, his face pale and sweating, while Chloe tried to straighten her dress, her hands shaking with a fear she could not hide. The game was no longer a long one, it was moving at the speed of a bullet, and I was the one who had pulled the trigger. They thought they were hiding their secrets in the dark, but I was the darkness, and I was about to consume them both. The heavy footsteps of Liam Vanderbilt echoed through the grand foyer like the tolling of a funeral bell for Julian Sterling's social standing, while the security guard's fingers dug into my arm, bruising the skin as he tried to shove me toward the service elevator hidden behind the ornate tapestries. I could hear Julian's breath hitch, a jagged and pathetic sound that betrayed his terror, as he frantically signaled Chloe to clear the desk of the incriminating documents that could send them both to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The air in the hallway was cold, smelling of rain and the expensive leather of Liam's boots, a stark contrast to the cloying scent of the red wine that was still dripping from my hair and soaking into my silk collar. I kept my body limp, my eyes staring into the distance with a practiced vacancy, while my smart lenses captured the sweat beads forming on the guard's forehead and the way Julian's hands were shaking as he smoothed his designer suit. Liam's voice was a low rumble of thunder, demanding to know why the gates were closed and where the mistress of the house was hiding, while Julian stammered about a sudden illness and the need for privacy. Every word Julian uttered was a lie, a thin veil over the rotting core of his betrayal. And I knew that the minute Liam stepped into this room, the balance of power would shift irrevocably in my favor. Liam did not wait for an invitation. Instead, he pushed past the stuttering butler, his presence filling the space with an undeniable authority that made the shadows in the corners seem to retreat in fear. I was only 10 feet away, concealed by the shadow of a marble pillar, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze searching the room for any sign of my existence. Julian hissed at the guard to move faster, his voice a venomous whisper that was drowned out by the sound of Liam's heavy cane striking the floor, as the billionaire stated that he had heard a woman's cry and would not leave until he confirmed Ava Montgomery's safety. The guard yanked my arm, making me stumble, but I used the momentum to drag my foot against a porcelain vase, sending it crashing to the floor in a symphony of shattered ceramic and wasted flowers. The sound was deafening in the tense silence, cutting through Julian's lies like a razor, and I felt the guard's grip tighten until I thought my bone might snap under the pressure. Chloe gasped, her heels clicking as she rushed to cover the mess, but it was too late because Liam's eyes had already locked onto the movement behind the pillar. Julian tried to block his view, offering a frantic explanation about a clumsy servant, but Liam's expression remained as cold and unyielding as a New York winter. "Release her at once," Liam commanded, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. While Julian attempted one last desperate gambit by claiming that I was in a state of mental instability and was being escorted to my room for my own protection. Chloe saw the doubt in Liam's eyes and decided to take a lethal risk, stepping forward with a fake expression of concern before she extended her foot to catch the hem of my wine-soaked dress. I felt the tug, the sudden loss of balance as she gave me a sharp shove toward the marble stairs, intending to prove my blindness by letting me fall headfirst into the abyss. I did not resist the fall. Instead, I leaned into it, allowing my body to tumble forward with a cry of terror that echoed through the mansion. While my hand reached out in a seemingly frantic search for stability, my fingers brushed against Julian's wrist as I fell, catching on the biometric scanner of his high-end watch, and I felt the micro device under my fingernail vibrate as it successfully cloned his unique fingerprint in a fraction of a second. The impact with the floor was a dull thud, a wave of white-hot pain blooming in my shoulder as I rolled across the stone. But the mission was accomplished, and I now held the key to his digital empire. Liam was at my side in an instant, his large hands lifting me from the ground with a gentleness that Julian had never possessed, while the scent of his expensive cologne replaced the smell of the gutter. He looked at the wine stains on my face, the bruises forming on my arms, and the way I stared past him with wide and sightless eyes, and I could feel the fury radiating from his body like a heat wave. Julian tried to approach, his face a mask of false worry, but Liam's arm was a steel barrier that kept the traitor at bay while he demanded an immediate explanation for the physical state of the woman he had come to protect. Chloe stood by the stairs, her face pale as she realized that her attempt to humiliate me had only served to incriminate Julian in a display of domestic horror that Liam would never forget. "You have 3 minutes to gather your things and get out of this house," Liam said to Julian, his voice a deadly whisper that promised a legal and financial storm that would level the sterling name to the ground. Julian began to argue, mentioning the prenuptial agreement and the Montgomery Trust. But Liam simply pulled a document from his coat. stating that the SEC had already frozen every account associated with the Sterling name pending a full investigation into money laundering. The look of absolute defeat on Julian's face was a hit of dopamine that almost made me break my facade. But I stayed still in Liam's arms, shivering as if I were a broken bird in a cage. Chloe began to scream, her voice a shrill and ugly sound as she realized that her dreams of becoming the Queen of Manhattan were evaporating into the cold night air. "You cannot do this," Julian roared, his eyes bloodshot with desperation. But Liam did not even look at him. Instead, he ordered his private security to escort the two of them to the gate with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I felt Liam's chest rise and fall, the steady beat of his heart a reminder that I was no longer alone in this fight. While the biometric data from Julian's watch was already being uploaded to my secret server, the biocheck was complete, giving me full access to the Montgomery jewel, the hidden drive that would restore my father's legacy and send Julian to a prison cell for the rest of his miserable life. The air in the mansion felt lighter, the darkness of the last 3 years finally beginning to lift, as Liam whispered into my ear that I was safe now and that the nightmare was over. But I knew better, because the war was only just beginning, and Julian Sterling was about to find out exactly what happens when you push a Montgomery too far. Just as the security team began to drag a sobbing Chloe toward the entrance, Julian lunged forward, his face twisted in a mask of pure insanity. As he screamed that I would never see my father alive if I dared to follow through with Liam's threats, he claimed that he had a man stationed at the clinic with a needle full of potassium chloride, ready to end the old man's life the moment the Sterling accounts were officially seized. Liam's grip on me tightened, his body tensing for a fight. But I maintained my blank stare. Even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a drum, this was the final shackle, the one thread Julian was using to keep me from cutting his throat. And the room fell into a suffocating silence as everyone waited for my reaction. Julian laughed, a jagged and broken sound, as he realized he still held a card in this deadly game of chess, while he demanded that Liam back off and return control of the company. Little did he know that my smart lenses were already linked to the clinic's security system, and I could see the Vanderbilt tactical team already neutralizing the assassin in the hallway of my father's ward. The trap was set. The biometric key was mine. And as I leaned my head against Liam's shoulder, I prepared to deliver the final blow that would turn Julian's hollow victory into a pile of ashes. Julian was screaming, his face a distorted mask of desperation, claiming that my father's life hung by a single thread, while Liam Vanderbilt didn't even grant him the courtesy of a glance. The air in the grand hallway was charged, thick with the smell of expensive red wine and the cold scent of New York rain, as Julian waved his phone like a weapon, threatening to send the signal that would end everything. I kept my head tucked against Liam's shoulder, my eyes vacant and staring at nothing. But my mind was sharp and calculating, watching the small green light on my lens feed, which confirmed that the Vanderbilt tactical team had already secured the private clinic. Julian's threats were nothing more than hollow echoes, the desperate barks of a dying animal that didn't realize its cage had already been locked from the outside. Liam moved forward, his stride steady and full of an ancient, terrifying power. As he stepped over the shattered porcelain and the soaked silk of my ruined dress, without breaking his rhythm or acknowledging the man he was about to destroy, the silence in the mansion was a heavy weight, pressing down on Julian's chest, as he slowly realized that his last card had no value in a game played by a man like Liam Vanderbilt. Suddenly, Julian roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated insanity, and lunged toward us with a silver letter opener he had snatched from the mahogany desk, his eyes bloodshot and full of a murderous intent that he could no longer hide. Liam didn't flinch. He didn't even slow down. Instead, he shifted his weight with the grace of a predator. while one of his personal guards stepped from the shadows with a speed that was almost invisible to the naked eye. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bone meeting hard marble, as Julian was pinned down to the floor, his face pressed against the very wine stains he had forced me to clean only minutes before. Chloe screamed, her voice a jagged glass edge that cut through the tension, while the security team dragged her further toward the exit, ignoring her pleas for mercy and her frantic, pathetic lies. I felt the vibration of the brief struggle through Liam's body, but his grip on me remained firm, a sanctuary of steel and silk that shielded me from the chaos he had unleashed upon my enemies. Julian was gasping for air, his designer suit ruined by the dust and the red liquid, looking every bit the failure he truly was, while Liam looked down at him with a coldness that was more painful than any physical strike. While the guards held Julian down, I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress, my fingers moving with a surgical precision that belied my supposed blindness, as I pressed the cloned biometric data against the encryption override device. In less than 5 seconds, the entire Sterling financial network was compromised. Every account, every offshore fund, and every hidden asset, all falling under the control of the Montgomery Trust. I felt a surge of cold, dark satisfaction, a joy that warmed my blood. As the command to liquidate was sent through the encrypted Vanderbilt server, effectively turning Julian into a pauper before he could even gather the strength to stand up, the digital walls were closing in on him, a silent execution of his social and economic life, while he remained pinned to the cold floor, oblivious to the fact that he no longer owned the very shoes on his feet. The air in the mansion finally felt cleaner, the stench of his presence beginning to fade, as the system confirmed that 72 separate bank accounts had been frozen indefinitely, pending a federal investigation. Julian was still struggling, his voice muffled by the marble, while I leaned closer to Liam, pretending to be the fragile victim while I held the sword that would finish this once and for all. Julian's phone, which had fallen a few feet away during the scuffle, began to vibrate incessantly, the screen flashing with urgent alerts from the Sterling Group's central treasury, notifying him of a massive and unauthorized asset transfer that was stripping him of every cent. He managed to crane his neck, his eyes widening in a terrifying horror as he saw the words, "Margin call" and "Account terminated," glowing in the dim light of the hallway. "You," Julian choked out, looking toward me with a sudden and terrifying realization, even as Liam began to walk away, carrying me toward the grand entrance where the Manhattan night was waiting to swallow us whole. He didn't know if it was Liam or some unseen ghost that had struck him, but the fear in his eyes was real, a deep and visceral terror that made his breath come in short, jagged bursts of panic. Chloe was already gone, her cries fading in the distance as she was tossed out like trash, leaving Julian alone in the ruins of the empire he had stolen. Now being reclaimed by the rightful heir, the mansion was no longer his home. It was a crime scene, and the judge was currently carrying me through the front doors toward a destiny he could never hope to stop. The cool air of New York hit my face, a refreshing contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the Sterling mansion, while the sound of the rain against the fleet of black vehicles created a rhythmic backdrop to our departure. Liam's pace didn't slacken, his footsteps firm on the wet pavement, as he moved toward the lead car, where a group of men in dark suits stood waiting with large black umbrellas held high. From the shadow of the last vehicle, a tall figure emerged, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. And I felt my breath hitch as I recognized the familiar gait of a man I hadn't seen in 5 long years. It was Marcus Thorne, the man who had been my father's most trusted advisor, the one who had disappeared the night the Montgomery estate was first attacked by Julian's hired thugs. He stepped into the light, his face scarred by the years of hiding but his eyes burning with the same loyalty that had once protected my family, and he bowed his head as Liam approached the car. The game was changing again. The old guard was returning to the field, and the forces of the Montgomery legacy were finally beginning to assemble for the final, bloody execution of everyone who had betrayed us. Marcus held the car door open, his voice a low, raspy rumble as he welcomed me back to the world of the living, while Liam placed me carefully onto the leather seat, never once breaking his protective vigil. "We have the files," Marcus said, his eyes flicking toward the mansion where Julian was still being detained by the Vanderbilt security team. "And the authorities are already moving in on the clinic to arrest the doctor." Julian's threat had been his final mistake, a gamble that had cost him the only piece of leverage he had left in this world. And now the hunters were becoming the hunted in the dark streets of New York. As the car door closed, I finally allowed myself to open my eyes, the vacancy replaced by a cold and lethal focus. And I looked at Liam with a clarity that would have terrified my enemies to their very core. "We are not going to the hospital," I said, my voice sounding like sharpened steel against stone. "We are going to the Sterling headquarters downtown. Because I want to be sitting in his chair when the sun rises over this city." The fleet of cars pulled away, the tires splashing through the puddles, leaving the Sterling legacy to drown in the darkness of the Manhattan night, while I prepared to take back everything that was mine. The city lights blurred past the window, a neon smear of blue and gold. As I watched the data from the Montgomery Jewel decrypting on my private tablet, revealing the names of every board member who had taken a bribe from Julian. Every name was a target. Every bribe was a nail in their coffins. And I felt no mercy, only a cold and calculated need for absolute destruction. Liam sat beside me, his presence a silent promise of violence, while he watched me work with a look of admiration that surpassed any romantic sentiment. He knew I was a weapon. He had known it from the moment he found me in that wreckage 3 years ago, and he was the only one who had the strength to stand by my side while I burned New York to the ground. My father's heartbeat was steady now. I could see it on my lens feed, a rhythmic pulse that matched the ticking of the clock as we approached the center of the financial district. The Sterling building loomed ahead, a glass tower built on a foundation of lies and blood. But tonight, I was the earthquake that would bring it all down. Marcus looked back from the front seat, a grim smile on his face, as he checked the safety on his weapon, knowing that the real fight was only just beginning. As the cars screeched to a halt in front of the Sterling Tower, the security guards at the entrance stepped back in confusion, overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Vanderbilt arrival. I stepped out of the car. No longer the blind wife, no longer the broken victim, but the ghost of a legacy that Julian thought he had buried forever. The rain soaked my hair, but I didn't care, because the fire inside me was enough to dry the ocean, and my eyes were fixed on the top floor where the throne of my father was waiting. Julian would be arriving soon, not in a limousine, but in the back of a police cruiser, and I wanted him to see me standing at the window, looking down at him from the heights he had tried to steal. This was Manhattan, a city where money was God and power was the only law that mattered. And tonight, I was both the judge and the executioner. The lobby doors hissed open, and I walked in with the authority of a queen returning to her kingdom. While the world prepared to watch the fall of the House of Sterling, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the executive floor, the sound of my heels striking the marble floors like rhythmic gunshots, as Marcus Thorne and Liam Vanderbilt walked a step behind me, creating an impenetrable wall of power that made the night shift security guards freeze in their tracks. They did not recognize the woman in the crimson suit, the one who walked with the cold, calculated precision of a predator, because they were still looking for the blind, broken wife who used to stumble through these halls in a state of perpetual fear. I did not stop to explain. I did not wait for permission. Instead, I moved toward the grand boardroom where the light leaked from under the mahogany doors, indicating that the scavengers were already gathered to feast on the remains of my father's empire. My eyes were wide open, crystal clear and burning with a lethal focus. As I signaled Marcus to override the biometric lock that Julian had installed to keep the rightful heir out of her own kingdom. The red light turned green with a soft click, a sound that signaled the end of Julian's reign, and I felt a surge of adrenaline as I prepared to face the men who had traded my family's legacy for a few $1 million in offshore bribes. The air in the hallway was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the rapid beating of my heart. As I reached for the door handle to reclaim my throne, the doors swung open with a violent grace, revealing 12 men sitting around the polished table, their faces turning pale as they looked at the woman they thought was rotting in a basement or crying in a dark room. I walked into the center of the room, my gaze sweeping over each of them with the weight of 1,000 sins, while Liam stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, like a silent judge ready to deliver a death sentence. Julian's chair was empty at the head of the table, a hollow space that I intended to fill before the clock struck 1. And the silence in the room was so thick that I could hear the panicked breathing of Mr. Henderson, the board chairman who had been Julian's primary accomplice. He tried to stand, his hands trembling as he reached for his briefcase, but a single look from Marcus Thorne made him collapse back into his seat, his eyes darting toward the security cameras that were already being redirected by my remote team. I am not here to negotiate. I am here to collect a debt that is 3 years overdue, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade, as I tossed the Montgomery jewel onto the table, the silver drive gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a piece of lethal evidence. They looked at the drive, then at my eyes, finally realizing that the blind girl had been watching them all along, recording every word, every theft, and every betrayal they had committed in the dark. I stepped closer to the table, my fingers pressing against the cold surface as I leaned forward, looking directly into the sweating face of the man who had authorized the sale of my father's manufacturing plants for 10 cents on the dollar. You thought I could not see you, Mr. Miller, when you were signing those fraudulent contracts in the library of my own home, while you made jokes about how easy it was to rob a blind woman, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt more dangerous than a scream. The color drained from his face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as the Montgomery jewel projected a holographic display onto the center of the table, showing the exact date, time, and amount of the bribe he had received. Every man in the room looked down at their hands, realizing that their secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows, but were being laid bare by the very person they had underestimated for 3 long years. Liam Vanderbilt stepped forward, his presence adding a layer of suffocating pressure to the atmosphere, as he informed them that his legal team had already filed a class action lawsuit against every individual sitting at this table. The board members began to murmur, a low sound of panic that rose like a tide, but I silenced them with a single gesture, reminding them that I was the one holding the keys to their futures and their freedom. As I spoke, the massive 50-inch screens on the boardroom walls suddenly flickered to life, overriding the corporate presentation with a live news feed from New York 1, showing a fleet of police cars surrounding the Sterling mansion. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, Julian Sterling arrested for money laundering and attempted murder, followed by a grainy shot of my husband being led away in handcuffs, his face hidden by a jacket. The men in the room gasped, some of them physically shrinking in their seats, as they realized that their protector had been stripped of his power and his freedom in a single, coordinated strike. I watched their reactions with a cold detachment, knowing that the fear they felt now was only a fraction of the terror I had endured while they laughed at my blindness behind my back. Julian is gone. And by sunrise, every account you have hidden in the Cayman Islands will be flagged by the Internal Revenue Service, unless you sign the documents I am about to place in front of you, I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. Marcus began distributing the folders, each one containing a pre-written confession and a formal resignation, a choice between corporate suicide or a lifetime in a federal penitentiary. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating with the scent of their desperation, but I did not feel a shred of pity for the men who had tried to bury me alive. One board member, a man named Arthur Vance, who had always been Julian's most loyal lapdog, suddenly slammed his fist on the table, his face turning a dark shade of purple as he reached for the internal phone to call the building's armed security. You think you can just walk in here with a Vanderbilt and play queen? You are still a Montgomery, a name that means nothing in this town anymore. He roared, his voice cracking with a hysterical rage that made him look pathetic. I did not move. I did not blink. Instead, I watched as Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his hand moving to his inner pocket with a deliberate slowness that made the entire room hold its breath. Before Vance could even lift the receiver, the phone on the table rang, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end was not his security team, but the New York District Attorney's office informing him that a warrant for his arrest had just been signed. Vance dropped the phone, the plastic clattering against the wood like a dead thing, as he looked at me with a sudden, crushing realization that I had anticipated every move, every counter, and every escape route. Liam walked toward the window, looking out at the city skyline with a bored expression, while I leaned forward, my face inches from Vance's, and whispered that his loyalty to Julian had just cost him his freedom, his fortune, and his future. The resistance was broken. The wolves were now sheep, and the boardroom was finally under my absolute control. I walked slowly toward the head of the table, my fingers trailing along the edge of the wood, until I reached the leather chair that Julian had occupied with such unearned arrogance for the past 3 years. I sat down, the familiar comfort of the seat sending a chill down my spine. As I looked at the broken men who were now frantically signing the documents I had provided, every signature was a victory, every stroke of the pen a reclaiming of a piece of my soul. And I felt the weight of the Montgomery legacy settling onto my shoulders with a renewed strength. By tomorrow morning, this building will be renamed, the Sterling sign will be torn down, and the world will know that Ava Montgomery has returned to finish what her father started. I announced, my voice echoing in the silent room with the power of a decree. I turned to look at Liam, who gave me a sharp nod of approval, and I realized that while I had won this battle, the war for my father's true heritage was still far from over. The agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission began entering the room, their dark jackets and official badges marking the end of the meeting. As they started the process of seizing the corporate records and escorting the board members out one by one, I stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked down at the streets of Manhattan, knowing that Julian was sitting in a cell, while I was sitting on top of the world. But as Marcus approached me with a grave look on his face, holding a new encrypted message on his phone, I knew that a new threat was already moving in the shadows. The fluorescent lights of the Manhattan North Precinct flickered with a rhythmic buzz, reflecting off the stainless steel table, while I sat in my charcoal silk suit, feeling the heavy silence of the interrogation room pressing against my skin. It had been exactly 24 hours since I stripped Julian Sterling of his name, his fortune, and his hollowed dignity. Yet the victory felt like a thin veil over a much deeper, more dangerous abyss. Marcus stood by the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, while the air in the small room smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the bitter scent of a man who had finally realized he was a ghost in his own life. The cameras were turned off. A courtesy from Liam Vanderbilt to the new CEO of Montgomery Holdings, allowing me a private moment to look into the eyes of the monster who had tried to bury me in the dark. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I only felt a cold, clinical curiosity about how a man could be so arrogant while standing on a foundation made of sand and stolen dreams. The city outside was moving at a frantic pace, but inside this box of concrete and steel, time seemed to stretch, waiting for the final confession of a cornered predator. The heavy iron door groaned open, and Julian was let in, his wrists bound by cold steel, his orange jumpsuit a glaring insult to the man who used to wear $3,000 Italian wool. He looked like a gutter rat, his hair matted with sweat, his eyes bloodshot and darting around the room with a frantic, primitive fear that made my stomach turn with a sudden, sharp disgust. He didn't look at the chair. He looked at my eyes. The eyes he thought were sightless for 3 long years, and I saw the moment his soul fractured under the weight of his own stupidity. "You look terrible, Julian," I said, my voice sounding like a low, dangerous hum in the quiet room, as I leaned forward, letting the light catch the diamonds on my watch. A piece he had tried to pawn months ago. He collapsed into the chair, the metal screeching against the floor, a sound that grated on my nerves like a jagged blade, while he gasped for air as if the very oxygen in the room belonged to me. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to scream, but I kept my face as smooth as marble, a statue of vengeance watching the slow, pathetic decay of a traitor who had dared to touch my father's legacy. "I am not here to gloat. Though the sight of you in this cage is worth more than the $10 billion you tried to steal," I whispered, my words measured and sharp, as I placed a single photograph of his offshore accounts on the table. Julian looked at the paper, his hands trembling so violently that the cuffs rattled against the steel, a frantic percussion of failure that echoed through the small space. He didn't speak, his throat working in a desperate attempt to swallow, until he finally looked up, his expression shifting from terror to a strange, hollow sort of madness that I had never seen before. "You think you won? Ava. But you are just a bigger prize in a much larger hunt," he choked out, his voice a raspy, broken mess that barely carried across the table. I watched him closely, my smart lenses recording every micro-expression, every twitch of his lips, as he leaned in, his breath smelling of the cheap prison food and the rot of his own fear. "They are coming for you, the ones who gave me the codes, the ones who wanted the Montgomery Trust for something much darker than a yacht or a penthouse in Manhattan," he hissed, his words tumbling out like a confession at the edge of a cliff. "The Shadow Trust," Julian whispered, the name sounding like a curse that chilled the air between us, as he explained that he was never the architect of my father's downfall, but merely a tool used by a ghost organization to infiltrate our family. He spoke of meetings in the back of blacked-out town cars, of encrypted messages that vanished in seconds, and of a deal that promised him the world in exchange for placing me in a psychiatric facility for life. My heart skipped a beat, a sudden jolt of anxiety that I masked with a cold stare, as I realized that the betray Tom Than, the asylum trap he had prepared for me, was a standard operating procedure for a force I didn't even know existed. He told me that Chloe was supposed to be the witness, the one who would sign the papers declaring me legally insane, ensuring that the Montgomery assets would be locked away in a trust they controlled from the shadows. The air in the room felt suffocating now, heavy with the realization that my victory was just the beginning of a much more lethal war against an enemy with no face and no name. Julian began to laugh, a high, jagged sound of pure hysteria. As he realized that he had been a pawn in a game he never understood, and that I was now the primary target of the very masters he had served. While I faced Julian in the precinct, Chloe Sterling was currently standing in a rain-soaked alley behind a low-life bar in the Bronx, her designer heels sinking into the grime of the New York slums. She had no money, no cards, and no friends left in the world of the elite. Only a burning, poisonous rage that consumed her like a fever. A man emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hood, the smell of cheap tobacco and old violence clinging to his clothes like a second skin. It was Dominic, a disgraced former head of Montgomery Security who had been fired by my father years ago for his ties to the Irish mob. A man who hated my name as much as Chloe did. "You want her dead, or do you want her to suffer?" Dominic asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver of terror through Chloe's desperate heart. "I want her to lose everything. I want to see her eyes go dark for real this time," Chloe hissed, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated malice as she handed him the only thing she had left. A stolen diamond necklace. They began to whisper, plotting a strike for the upcoming Ham Chuck, the inauguration gala where I would officially be crowned the CEO of the new Montgomery Group. A night meant for celebration that they intended to turn into a bloodbath. I returned to the Vanderbilt penthouse late that night, the city lights below me looking like a carpet of fallen stars. But I felt no peace, only a growing sense of dread that even Liam's presence could not completely soothe. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his expression grave as Marcus delivered the report on the encrypted message we had intercepted earlier. "This is not a local game anymore. Ava, the Shadow Trust is a conglomerate of old money and new tech. A ghost that buys and sells entire legacies without ever leaving a footprint," Liam warned, his voice deep and full of a protective authority. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch warm but firm. As he told me that my father's discovery of their laundering network was the real reason for the attack 3 years ago. They didn't just want the money, they wanted the silence. And by sitting in that CEO chair, you have become the loud, clear signal that they need to extinguish before the sun rises on your new empire. I looked at the digital map of New York on the wall, seeing the red dots marking the known assets of the Sterling family, and realized that every one of them was now a potential trap, a fuse waiting to be lit by an unseen hand. The gala was only 48 hours away, a high-stakes event at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that would bring together the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world, a perfect stage for a public execution. I spent the night reviewing security protocols, my eyes burning from the blue light of the tablet, while Liam's team worked to identify the guests who might be working for the Shadow Trust. Every invitation was a liability. Every waiter was a potential threat. And I felt the weight of my father's legacy pressing down on me, a heavy crown of thorns that I refused to remove. Marcus brought me a small, unmarked package that had been left at the service entrance of the building, his face pale and his movements cautious as he placed it on the marble counter. It contained a single, antique key to a room in a long abandoned sanitarium on the outskirts of New York, a place where the Montgomery family had once donated millions to help the mentally ill. There was no note, no name, only the cold, metallic smell of the key and the implied threat of the betrayal that Julian had whispered about in the interrogation room. The hunters were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were knocking on my door, inviting me to a dance of death that would decide the fate of my family once and for all. I looked at the key, my reflection in the polished metal looking back at me with a cold, unwavering determination that surprised even myself, as I realized that I couldn't just defend, I had to attack. Liam wanted to cancel the gala, to move me to a secure location in the Swiss Alps, but I refused to run. I refused to let the ghosts of the past dictate the future of the Montgomery name. If they want a show, I will give them one they will never forget, I said, my voice sounding like a lethal decree in the quiet of the penthouse, as I began to formulate a plan to turn the gala into a giant, high-tech trap. I would walk into the lion's den, not as a victim, but as the master of the hunt, using the very technology that had kept me hidden for 3 years to expose the Shadow Trust to the entire world. The stakes were no longer just about money or a company. They were about survival, about proving that a Montgomery could not be broken by the lies of the dark. The night was long, but as the first light of dawn began to touch the skyline of New York, I felt a surge of energy, a fierce, burning resolve that told me I was ready for the final, bloody confrontation. Julian was a pawn, Chloe was a nuisance, but the Shadow Trust was the true enemy. And tonight, I was going to find out exactly who was pulling the strings behind the curtain. Marcus entered the room again, his phone vibrating with a new alert, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp alarm that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a frantic bird. "We have a breach at the clinic. The security feed went dark 5 minutes ago, and the Vanderbilt team on site is not responding to our signals," he reported, his voice tight with a fear he couldn't hide. I felt a wave of icy terror wash over me, the thought of my father being at the mercy of the Shadow Trust making my hands shake for the first time in years. This was the opening move. The distraction meant to draw me out and break my spirit before the gala even began. A move so cruel and calculated that it could only have come from a mind that knew no mercy. I looked at Liam, who was already reaching for his coat and signaling the tactical team to prep the helicopter on the roof, his face a mask of lethal focus. "We are going now," he said, his voice a promise of violence that echoed in the quiet room, while I grabbed my coat and the antique key, my eyes burning with a cold, dark fire that promised a reckoning New York would never forget. The game was no longer being played by the rules. It was a race against the clock to save the only man I had left in this world, and I would burn the entire city to the ground to find him. The hospital room was cold, the scent of antiseptic mixing with the lingering, metallic smell of fear, as I stared at the empty bed where my father should have been recovering from his latest surgery. The white sheets were pulled tight, not a single wrinkle left behind, as if he had never existed in this sterile space, while the painted clown mask on the pillow mocked me with its frozen crimson grin. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal, as Marcus checked the security terminal only to find the wires had been cut with a surgical precision that screamed of professional intervention. Liam stood behind me, his hand a heavy, warm weight on my shoulder. But I pulled away, my mind already spinning with the cold calculations of a woman who had nothing left to lose in this city of ghosts. They had taken the only piece of my soul that Julian hadn't managed to crush, and I felt the darkness rising inside me, a lethal tide that promised to swallow New York whole before the sun could rise again. This was not a kidnapping. It was an invitation to a slaughter. And I was the guest of honor in a game that had been rigged from the very beginning by an enemy I could not see. I did not wait for Liam to suggest a search party. Instead, I pulled my private tablet from the inner pocket of my coat, my fingers dancing across the screen to activate the subdermal tracker I had secretly implanted in my father's shoulder 2 months ago. Julian had been too arrogant to notice the small incision, and the Shadow Trust had been too focused on their theatrical masks to check for a biosignal that did not appear on any standard medical scanner. A small red dot flickered to life on the digital map of the city, moving steadily north toward the overgrown, forgotten outskirts of Westchester, where the old money families buried their secrets and their dead in the dark. Liam leaned in. His eyes narrowed as he watched the signal. But I saw a flicker of something else in his expression. A moment of recognition that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a warning. He knew that location. He knew the blacked-out area on the map where the signal was heading. And for the first time since he saved me, I felt a seed of doubt about the man who had been my only ally. The air in the hospital room felt thinner, the hum of the remaining machines sounding like a countdown to an explosion that I could no longer stop or delay. As we rushed toward the roof to the waiting Vanderbilt helicopter, I pulled up a hidden file that Marcus had managed to extract from Julian's encrypted drive during the boardroom takeover earlier that night. It was a series of transactions from 10 years ago, long before I met Julian, showing a massive investment from a shell company linked to the Vanderbilt estate into a project called the Shadow Initiative. My hands shook as I read the name of the primary shareholder, Liam Vanderbilt. The very man who was currently holding my hand and promising to burn the world down to find my father in the ruins. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, as I realized that the man I trusted might have been the one who built the very cage my family was currently trapped in like common animals. I did not say a word. I kept my face as smooth as ice while the helicopter lifted off into the stormy New York night. The city lights below us looking like a field of glowing embers in the rain. I looked at Liam, his profile sharp and noble against the dark sky, and I wondered if he was saving me from the monsters, or simply bringing me back to the master who had created them years ago. The helicopter landed on a patch of dead grass near the gates of the St. Jude's Cemetery, a place where the headstones were crumbling under the weight of a century of neglect, and the trees looked like twisted, reaching hands. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the cold, ozone smell of an approaching storm. As the Vanderbilt tactical team fanned out with their weapons drawn and their thermal goggles glowing in the dark, I stepped out of the cabin, the wind whipping my hair across my face, while the tracker on my tablet indicated that my father was less than 100 yards away. Hidden beneath the earth in one of the old vaults, Liam tried to pull me back, his voice a low, urgent whisper that sounded more like a warning than a plea. As he told me that the Shadow Trust was using the cemetery as a killing floor tonight, I ignored him, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, as I realized that the man I once considered my savior was now just another obstacle in my path to the final, bloody truth. The silence of the graveyard was broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the gravel, a rhythmic, haunting noise that felt like a march toward an inevitable and lethal reckoning. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sharp crack of a high-caliber rifle, the bullet whistling past my ear and striking the granite of a nearby monument with a shower of sparks and stone dust. The Vanderbilt guards returned fire instantly, their suppressed weapons spitting tongues of orange flame into the darkness, as three figures emerged from behind the marble mausoleums with the fluid, lethal grace of professional assassins. These were not Julian's pathetic thugs. These were the cleaners of the Shadow Trust. Men who were paid to make problems disappear without leaving a single trace for the police to find in the morning. I dived behind a heavy headstone, my fingers gripping the small, antique key I had found in the penthouse, as I watched Liam draw a weapon and fire with a cold, terrifying accuracy. The air was filled with the sound of whizzing lead and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground, while the storm finally broke overhead. A sudden downpour of freezing rain that washed the blood into the thirsty soil. I felt no fear, only a cold, crystalline focus as I realized that the only way out of this graveyard was over the bodies of the people who had tried to destroy my name. One of the assassins managed to get within 10 feet of me, a long serrated blade gleaming in his hand as he lunged forward with a silent, murderous intent that I had not expected from him. I did not scream. I did not hesitate. Instead, I used the weight of my heavy designer coat to tangle his arm. While I drove my heel into his knee with a force that sent a sickening crack through the air, he collapsed, his breath coming in a jagged, painful gasp. But I did not stop. Instead, I grabbed his wrist and twisted until the blade fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered against the stone. I saw the mark on his neck. A small, tattooed sigil of a serpent eating its own tail. The symbol of the shadow trust that Julian had mentioned in his moment of absolute cowardice. Liam was at my side a second later, his face covered in rain and a darkness that I could not recognize, as he looked at the wounded man with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "He is one of mine," Liam whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that confirmed my worst fears about the connection between the Vanderbilt name and the people who stole my father. The realization was a physical blow, a wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me, as the man who was supposed to be my protector stood over the fallen assassin like a demon. The assassin began to laugh, a wet, choking sound that was filled with a terrifying, hollow sort of joy. As he looked at Liam and then back at me, with eyes that were already glazing over. "You are too late. The master has already moved the old man to the asylum, and he is waiting for his favorite student to come home for the final lesson." The man choked out before his body went limp against the cold marble floor. Liam looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate, pleading sort of honesty. As he tried to explain that he had left the Shadow Trust years ago to build his own empire, I did not believe him. I could not believe anyone anymore. As I looked at the antique key in my hand and realized that the asylum was not just a threat, but a destination I was destined to reach. My father was alive, but he was being held in the very place where the Montgomery legacy began and where it was now intended to end in a final, bloody act of sacrifice. I turned away from Liam, my heart as cold as the rain, as I realized that the only person I could trust in this city of ghosts was myself and the ghosts of the family I had lost. I walked toward the gates of the cemetery, my footsteps heavy in the mud. As I ignored Liam's calls and the frantic movement of the remaining Vanderbilt guards who were trying to secure the perimeter, I reached my private car, which Marcus had left idling at the entrance as a secondary escape route, and I slid into the driver's seat with a determination that felt like a weapon. The Shadow Trust wanted me to come alone. They wanted me to face the master in the halls of the abandoned sanitarium, and I was going to give them exactly what they wanted tonight. I looked in the rearview mirror, seeing Liam standing under the pouring rain, his figure shrinking in the distance. A man who had lied to me even while he saved me from the gutter. This was Manhattan, a city where everyone had a secret and every secret was a knife in the dark. And tonight, I was going to turn that knife on the people who had dared to think I was a victim. The car roared to life, the tires spinning on the gravel, as I sped away from the graveyard and toward the asylum, leaving the light of the city behind for the absolute darkness. My father was waiting. The Shadow Trust was waiting. And as I gripped the steering wheel, I felt the final, cold pieces of the Montgomery puzzle falling into place. The road toward the old sanitarium was a winding path of asphalt and shadows, the trees on either side arching over the car like the ribs of a giant, ancient beast that had swallowed the world. I drove with the headlights off, using the night vision capability of my smart lenses to navigate the turns, while the rain drummed a frantic rhythm against the roof of the vehicle. Every mile I traveled took me further away from the rules of civilization and closer to the law of the jungle that the Shadow Trust used to govern their hidden empire. I could feel the presence of the antique key in my pocket, its cold metal pressing against my thigh, a reminder of the secrets that were buried in the walls of the place I was heading. My father's signal had gone dark again, a sign that they had entered the reinforced concrete of the lower levels, where the signal from my subdermal tracker could no longer reach the Vanderbilt satellite. I was alone, truly alone for the first time since the accident, and yet I felt a strange sense of clarity, a peace that only comes when you are walking toward the end of a long and bloody war. The gates of the asylum loomed ahead, a rusted iron barrier that seemed to groan in anticipation as the car slowed to a halt in the darkness. I stepped out of the car, the silence of the woods so absolute that I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the leaves and the distant, lonely cry of a predator in the night. The building itself was a sprawling, Gothic nightmare of stone and broken glass, its towers reaching toward the stormy sky like the fingers of a drowning man. This was the birthplace of the Shadow Trust, a place where they had once performed experiments on the minds of the helpless to find the keys to absolute control and power. I walked toward the front entrance, my hand reaching for the weapon hidden beneath my coat, while my eyes scanned the windows for any sign of movement or light. The heavy doors were unlocked, swinging open with a slow, deliberate sound that felt like an invitation into the mouth of a shark, and I walked into the grand foyer without hesitation. The air inside was stale and smelled of dust, mold, and the faint, lingering scent of ancient medicine and even older suffering that had never been allowed to fade away. I was home, in a way that I had never wanted to be, and as I looked into the darkness of the main hallway, I knew that the master was already watching me from the shadows. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound echoed through the foyer, the sound of heels on stone that was so familiar it made my heart stop for a second in my chest. From the shadows of the grand staircase, a woman emerged, her figure elegant and her face illuminated by a single, flickering flashlight that she held in her gloved hand. It was not the master, but Chloe Sterling. Her face no longer a mask of fear, but a twisted grin of triumph that showed she had finally found a way back into the game. "You were always so predictable, Ava, thinking you were the hunter when you were really just the bait for a much larger trap," Chloe whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow space with a chilling sort of sweetness. She stepped closer, a small remote control in her other hand, and I realized with a sudden, sharp dread that she was the one who had been given the task of finishing me off. The Vanderbilt team would not find me here. Liam would not find me here. And as Chloe raised the remote, I realized that the betrayal was finally closing its iron jaws around my neck. The darkness seemed to move around us, and as a low, gravelly laugh sounded from the top of the stairs, I knew that the real nightmare was only just beginning for the last of the Montgomerys. I stood in the center of the rotting lobby, the smell of decaying wood and old medicine thick enough to taste, while Chloe Sterling stepped closer with a smirk that was more poisonous than the venom she had used on Julian. She was twirling the remote control like a toy, her eyes bright with a manic sort of joy, as she told me that my blindness was a blessing compared to what the Shadow Trust had planned for my final hours in this world. "You were always the smart one, Ava. But even a genius cannot survive a fall from the heights we are about to take you to," she whispered, her voice echoing in the hollow space like the sound of dry leaves on a grave. I didn't look at her. I looked at the figure on the stairs, a shadow that was beginning to take the shape of a man I thought I had buried 5 years ago at the St. Patrick's Cathedral. The air became colder, a deep and visceral chill that made my skin crawl, as the man stepped into the light, revealing a face that was a mirror image of my father, but twisted by a darkness that I could never have imagined. Silas Montgomery, my uncle, the man who had supposedly died in a plane crash over the Atlantic, stood before me with a chilling smile that made my blood run cold and my heart stop for a single, agonizing second. He wasn't a ghost. He was the architect of my misery, the one who had guided Julian's hand and fed Chloe's greed, all to ensure that the Montgomery lineage was purged of its light and replaced by his own twisted version of power. He spoke of the bloodline, of a secret ledger hidden within the Montgomery jewel that held the keys to the entire New York financial grid, a legacy that my father had tried to hide from the world because he was too weak to use it. Silas didn't want the money. He wanted the absolute control that came with the digital keys I now held in my possession. And he told me that Chloe was merely a distraction to bring me here, to this place where our family's madness began. I felt a wave of nausea, a physical blow to my stomach, as I realized that the war I had been fighting against Julian was just a skirmish in a much larger conflict between the living and the dead. Silas demanded that I connect my tablet to the asylum's central server and initiate the transfer of the Shadow Initiative's codes, threatening to cut my father's oxygen supply if I hesitated for even a fraction of a heartbeat. Chloe was getting impatient, her hands shaking with a desperate need to see me bleed, and she lunged forward with a scalpel she had hidden in her glove, aiming for my throat with a cry of pure, unadulterated hatred. Silas moved with a speed that was terrifying for a man of his age, catching her wrist and twisting it until she dropped the blade with a sharp gasp of pain that echoed through the dark foyer. "She is more valuable alive for now." "You pathetic creature," Silas hissed, his voice a low and dangerous rumble that made Chloe shrink back into the shadows like a kicked dog. I watched them, my mind already working through the encryption protocols of the Montgomery jewel, finding the hidden failsafe that my father had installed for this exact moment of ultimate betrayal. Silas didn't know that the keys he wanted were also the triggers for a digital explosion that would wipe the Shadow Trust's existence from every server in Manhattan. I opened the tablet, the blue light illuminating my face in the darkness, and I began the process of unlocking the Montgomery jewel. While I spoke to Silas about the night his plane went down and the lies he had told our family for a decade. I told him that I knew about the Vanderbilt connection, about the money Liam had used to build his own empire, and how Silas had used Liam as a scapegoat to keep the FBI away from his own shadow organization. The progress bar on the screen was moving toward 99%, his eyes reflecting the glow of the data that he believed would make him a god of New York. He didn't realize that I was also activating the silent distress signal through the antique key in my pocket, a signal that was being picked up by Marcus Thorne's backup server in the Vanderbilt penthouse. The air in the room seemed to hum with a high-frequency vibration, a sound that only I could hear through my iris lenses. As the local security system began to malfunction under the weight of my father's hidden code, I was no longer a victim waiting for a rescue. I was the queen of a crumbling empire, and I was about to set the entire building on fire. The progress bar suddenly turned a violent shade of red, and a single word appeared on the screen in a font that looked like my father's handwriting: unauthorized. As the lights in the lobby began to flicker and the electronic locks on the doors slammed shut, Silas roared in a voice that was full of a primal, terrifying fury, realizing that I had not given him the codes, but had instead uploaded a virus that was currently eating through his entire network at the speed of light. Chloe tried to run for the exit, but the heavy iron gates dropped from the ceiling, trapping us all in the rotting foyer while the sound of a helicopter's rotors began to drown out the noise of the rain. I stood up, my eyes fixed on Silas, and I told him that he was the one who was predictable, thinking that a Montgomery woman would ever surrender the keys to her family's soul to a traitor. The air was filled with the smell of ozone and burnt electronics, as the backup generators failed and the darkness returned to the asylum. But I wasn't afraid because I could see every heat signature in the room through my tactical lenses. I was the hunter now, and the master was just another target in my sights, while Liam's voice crackled through the intercom system, telling Silas that his time was officially up. The main doors exploded inward with a force that sent a cloud of dust and debris flying across the lobby. As Liam Vanderbilt stepped through the smoke with a tactical rifle in his hands and a look of pure, unadulterated vengeance on his face, he didn't look at Silas. He looked at me, his eyes searching for any sign of injury before he moved with a fluid, lethal grace to stand by my side in the middle of the chaos. Silas grabbed Chloe and held a weapon to her head, using his own accomplice as a human shield while he backed away toward the stairs, his face a mask of desperation and hatred. He told Liam that if anyone moved, he would trigger the explosives he had planted in the basement where my father was being held, a final act of scorched earth that would ensure no one left this building alive. I looked at the timer on my tablet, seeing that the virus had already reached the basement's control system, and I knew that Silas was bluffing because his remote was no longer connected to the detonators. I stepped forward, my voice steady and cold as I told Liam to lower his weapon, while I reached for the antique key and prepared to unlock the final door to my family's salvation. The endgame was here, and as Silas realized his power was gone, he did something I never expected. He threw Chloe toward us and vanished into the darkness of the upper floors. Chloe hit the floor with a heavy thud, her breath coming in jagged gasps as she realized that her master had abandoned her to the mercy of the queen she had tried to destroy. I didn't even look at her as I ran toward the basement stairs, my heart pounding with the hope that I could still save the only man who had ever truly loved me. The war for New York was ending, and as the lights of the Vanderbilt tactical team illuminated the ruins of the asylum, I knew that the Montgomery name would finally be cleared of its shadows. I kicked the steel door open, the rusted hinges screaming like a dying banshee, and my eyes locked onto Dominic, who held a jagged blade against my father's throat. My father looked frail, his skin the color of old parchment, yet his eyes were steady, reflecting a hidden strength that made my heart ache with a sudden, sharp clarity. Dominic's face was a map of scars and old grudges, his grin looking like a raw wound in the flickering light of the damp basement, as he told me that one step closer would mean the end of the Montgomery line. I did not stop. I did not flinch. Instead, I moved with the cold, lethal grace of a woman who had spent 3 years learning how to kill with a glance, while my iris lenses recorded every twitch of his murderous hand. From a speaker in the corner, the voice of Silas Montgomery echoed, a high, jagged sound of pure insanity, informing me that the victory I tasted was nothing but ashes because my father was already a dead man walking. He claimed that a slow-acting neurotoxin was currently coursing through my father's veins, a poison that only he could neutralize with a custom serum hidden on the roof of this hellhole. The air in the room was thick with the scent of mold and the cold smell of impending death. But I felt a fire in my blood that promised a reckoning Manhattan would never forget. Dominic lunged at me, his blade flashing in the dim light. But I shifted my weight, driving my palm into his throat with a force that sent a sickening crack through the small, enclosed space. He gasped for air, his eyes widening in a terrifying surprise, as I grabbed his wrist and twisted until the bone snapped like a dry twig under a heavy boot. I did not give him a second to breathe. Instead, I slammed my knee into his chest, followed by a sharp elbow to his temple that sent him crashing against the concrete wall in a heap of broken pride and wasted violence. My father watched, his breath shallow but his expression calm, as he whispered for me to ignore him and go after the serum before Silas could disappear into the New York night forever. I grabbed a medical kit from the metal shelf, my fingers moving with a surgical precision to stabilize his vitals, while my tablet confirmed that the federal indictments were finally being executed across the entire Shadow Trust network. Thousands of miles away, bank accounts were being seized, luxury yachts were being impounded, and the men who had built their empires on my family's blood were finally facing a lethal and inescapable justice. My father reached out, his hand cold and trembling. As he pulled me closer and whispered a secret that felt more explosive than the bombs Silas had tried to plant in the foundation. He told me that he had known about Silas for 10 years, that he had allowed himself to be captured and poisoned to ensure that the Shadow Trust would expose their entire architecture to someone they deemed a weak and sightless victim. You were the only one who could do it, Ava. Because you were the only one they truly underestimated, he murmured, his voice a low, raspy rumble of pride that made the world around me seem to blur for a single, agonizing moment. He had sacrificed his health, his dignity, and his safety to give me the ultimate weapon against the master. A digital backdoor into Silas's private cloud that was currently being accessed by Marcus Thorne. The air felt heavy with the weight of his sacrifice, a burden of love that I had never expected from the man who used to run New York with an iron fist and a heart of gold. I kissed his forehead, promising him that I would return with the serum. As the sound of Liam's footsteps echoed from the staircase, signaling that the final hunt was heading toward the sky, I ran through the dark hallways, my heels sounding like a frantic drumbeat against the stone. As I headed toward the rooftop where the final confrontation was waiting for its leading lady, the air was colder now, the rain turning into a sleet that stung my skin like 1,000 needles, while the wind howled through the broken windows of the upper floors like a chorus of vengeful spirits. I reached the metal stairs, my lungs burning with every step, until I burst onto the roof to find Liam Vanderbilt standing at the edge of the ledge, his tactical rifle aimed directly at Silas Montgomery's chest. Silas was holding a small, glowing vial of blue liquid, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated madness as he looked out at the city lights of Manhattan. A king without a kingdom in a world he no longer understood. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the ventilation unit, and my heart skipped a beat as I recognized the pathetic, trembling form of Julian Sterling, looking as though he had crawled through a sewer to reach this place. He had been released by the master to act as a human shield. A final insult to the man I once thought I loved, as he stood between Liam and the man who held my father's life in his hands. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying sort of hope, as he begged me to tell Liam to lower his weapon so that we could all walk away from this nightmare with our lives intact. You do not understand. Ava. He is going to drop the serum. He will kill us all if you do not listen, Julian screamed, his voice a shrill and ugly sound that was swallowed by the roar of the wind and the distant sirens of the New York Police Department. I did not look at Julian. I looked at Silas, the man who had tried to steal my heritage, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical need to see him fall from the height he had occupied for too long. The vial of blue liquid was the only thing standing between my father and a shallow grave, and Silas knew it, his fingers tightening around the glass with a smirk that was as sharp as a razor. Liam's hand was steady on the trigger, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the silent battle between his duty as a Vanderbilt and his love for the woman who had become his entire world. The air felt like it was charged with a lethal voltage, a moment of absolute stillness before the storm finally broke and the blood began to flow across the wet concrete. I stepped forward, my voice sounding like a lethal decree in the quiet of the roof, as I told Silas that his Shadow Trust was already a memory, a ghost of a company that had been liquidated by the federal government in the last 10 minutes. Marcus Thorne has already seized your private servers. Your money is gone. And your allies are currently being arrested in 5 different countries, I announced, my words striking him with the force of a physical blow. Silas looked at the vial, his expression shifting from arrogance to a crushing realization that his leverage was gone, and for a second, I saw the coward behind the master's mask. Julian tried to run toward Silas, hoping to snatch the serum for himself, but Liam moved with the grace of a predator, intercepting the traitor with a single, powerful strike that sent Julian crashing to the floor in a heap of broken dreams. Silas raised the vial, intending to smash it against the ledge, but before he could move his hand, a single shot rang out from the darkness, a sound that cut through the night like a lightning bolt. Silas's hand went limp, the vial falling through the air in slow motion, and I dived toward the edge, my fingers reaching for the only thing that mattered in a world that was currently falling apart around me. I caught the vial just as it cleared the ledge, the cool glass pressing against my palm like a miracle, while Silas staggered back, his eyes looking up at the sky as if he were searching for a god that had never listened to his prayers. Liam was at my side in an instant, his arm around my waist as we watched Silas lose his balance and disappear into the darkness below. A silent fall that marked the end of the Shadow Trust and the beginning of a new era for the Montgomery name. Julian was sobbing on the roof, a pathetic and broken thing that no longer deserved my attention. As I looked at the serum and felt the weight of my father's sacrifice finally lifting from my shoulders, the war was over. The master was gone. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon over the East River, I knew that Manhattan finally belonged to its rightful queen. But as Liam pulled me closer, whispering a name I had not heard in years, I realized that the secret Silas had died for was far more dangerous than any company or bank account. The Shadow Trust was just the first layer of a much deeper, more ancient conspiracy. And the real fight was only just beginning in the heart of the city that never sleeps. I raced down the damp, concrete stairs of the basement, my lungs burning with every breath, while the blue light from the vial in my hand flickered like a dying star in the absolute darkness of the corridor. I reached my father's bedside. His heart monitor was a frantic, erratic sound that echoed off the peeling walls, telling me that his time was measured in seconds rather than minutes. I looked at the glass, my eyes zooming in on the micro-engraved text that Silas had left behind, a final insult from a man who wanted to play God even as he fell to his death. It said that the Montgomery legacy was written in blood, and that the vial was only a catalyst, a chemical trigger that required a genetic match to become the life-saving serum my father so desperately needed. I felt a surge of cold, calculated desperation, realizing that Silas had designed this trap to force me to choose between my own health and my father's survival. A psychological game that he hoped would break my spirit one last time. My father's hand was a cold, skeletal weight on the sheets, his eyes fluttering as he struggled to maintain a connection to a world that was rapidly fading into gray. While I prepared to sacrifice everything to pull him back from the edge, I grabbed a sterile syringe from the metal tray, my fingers moving with a surgical precision that I had honed through years of hidden preparation. And I drove the needle into my own vein without a single flinch or hesitation. The warm, crimson liquid flowed into the chamber, mixing with the blue catalyst in a swirling dance of science and desperation. While I monitored the chemical reaction through my tactical lenses to ensure the purity of the mixture, my vision began to blur, a wave of lightheadedness washing over me as the blood loss started to take its toll. But I refused to collapse until the serum was ready to be administered to the man who had given me everything. Every second felt like an eternity, the sound of the rain outside sounding like the ticking of a clock that was rapidly approaching midnight. As I injected the final solution into my father's intravenous line, I watched his face, waiting for a sign of life, while the silence in the basement became a heavy, suffocating blanket that threatened to extinguish the last flicker of hope in my heart. The air smelled of chemicals and old earth, a combination that reminded me of the basement where Silas had tried to bury our family's secrets. But now it was the birthplace of a miracle. Julian Sterling appeared in the doorway, his eyes red and his face a mask of absolute regret. As he watched me draw my own blood into the cold, sterile syringe, he was a broken man, a shadow of the arrogant billionaire who had once looked down on me with such unearned contempt, and I saw the moment he noticed the red laser dot dancing across my chest. A sniper was still lurking in the ventilation shaft, a last remnant of the Shadow Trust's cleaners who were paid to ensure that no Montgomery left this hospital alive. Julian didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. Instead, he lunged forward with a speed I didn't know he possessed, throwing his body in front of mine just as the muffled crack of a silenced rifle echoed through the room. The impact sent him crashing into the metal tray of instruments, a sound of clattering steel that masked the jagged gasp of his final breath. While I stood frozen with the syringe of my own blood held against my father's arm, he fell to the floor, his eyes looking up at me with a silent apology that carried more weight than any words he could have spoken. And I realized that he had finally found a way to be something other than a liability in my life. "I am sorry, Ava," was all he managed to whisper. A faint and broken sound that was swallowed by the hum of the machines and the distant sirens of the New York Police Department. I watched the life fade from his eyes, the man who had been my greatest enemy and my most painful lesson. And I felt a strange sense of closure that I hadn't expected to find in this den of horrors. My father's heart monitor suddenly changed its tune, the frantic beeping slowing into a steady, rhythmic pulse that told me the serum was working, a melody of survival that made the tears finally sting my eyes. Liam Vanderbilt burst into the room a second later, his weapon drawn and his face a mask of lethal authority. As his team moved to neutralize the sniper and secure the perimeter of the abandoned asylum, he looked at Julian's body, then at me, and he saw the blood on my arm and the clarity in my gaze. Realizing that the Queen of Manhattan had finally reclaimed her kingdom through a sacrifice of her own. The air in the basement finally began to clear, the darkness receding as the Vanderbilt guards flooded the space with light, marking the official end of the House of Sterling and the rebirth of the Montgomery legacy. We emerged from the hospital as the sun began to rise over the skyline of New York, a pale gold light that touched the glass of the skyscrapers and turned the river into a ribbon of liquid silver. My father was being carried into a waiting medical helicopter, his vitals stable and his future secured, while Marcus Thorne stood by the lead car with a tablet that showed the final dissolution of the Shadow Trust. Every offshore account was gone, every board member was in custody, and the name Montgomery was already trending on every news outlet from London to Tokyo as the new symbol of corporate resilience. I looked at Liam, who stood beside me with a quiet respect that was far more valuable than the billions of dollars we had just reclaimed from the wreckage of Silas's ambition. "You did it, Ava. You burned them all to the ground," he said, his voice a low and steady rumble that carried the weight of 1,000 promises he intended to keep in the years to come. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt like a survivor. But as I looked out at the city that had tried to break me, I knew that I was the one who was still standing while the wolves were all dead or in cages. The Sterling sign on the top of the tower downtown was being dismantled by a crew of workers, the letters falling away to reveal the original Montgomery logo that had been hidden beneath the surface for 3 long years. I stood in my office, the chair finally feeling like it belonged to me, as I signed the first executive order to donate 50% of our recovered assets to the public hospitals of New York. This was no longer about revenge. It was about rebuilding a world that had been poisoned by the greed of men like Silas and Julian. A task that would take a lifetime to complete, but one that I was ready to lead. Liam walked into the room, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands, and we stood together by the window, watching the city move below us like a living, breathing machine that finally had a heart again. The Shadow Trust was a memory, the asylum was a ruin, and as I took a sip of the cold liquid, I felt the final shackle of my past falling away into the darkness of the history books. Manhattan was mine, not because I had stolen it, but because I had earned it with my blood, my tears, and a vision that was no longer clouded by the lies of the blind. I looked at the photograph of my father on the desk, his smile a reminder of the man I had saved. And I realized that the greatest power in New York wasn't money or influence, but the ability to stand in the light without being afraid of the shadows. The phone on the desk rang, a sound that signaled the beginning of a new day and a new era for Montgomery Holdings, and I answered it with a voice that was clear, strong, and full of a lethal confidence. "This is Ava Montgomery. How can I help you?" I said, as the camera panned out to show the bustling streets of the city I had conquered. A queen sitting on a throne of glass and steel, ready to face whatever new challenges the world decided to throw my way. The dawn was bright. The sky was clear. And as I looked at Liam, I knew that our story was only just beginning. A saga of power, love, and a legacy that would never be forgotten by the people of New York. The darkness was gone, the light had returned, and the Queen was finally home to stay in the city that never sleeps.